LGBTQIA+ community, queerness, to be queer. These terms are often used to attempt to describe many genders, gender identities, and sexual orientations that deviate from gender-normative and heterosexual norms.
People identifying with a label under the umbrella term queer have been visible in just recent decades, loud and proud and always having to fight for spaces and changes in society.
But this space for queer people has and is still being contested around the world. Even in the so-called Western countries that have had strong social movements, such as the gay rights activism since the 1960s, progressive laws such as the same-sex marriage and even just the visibility of queerness at events as Christopher Street Day parades are subjects of heated debates.
By far, not everyone wants to accept and include queer people, their identities and views in society, going so far as being part of far-right protests to disrupt CSD parades and attacking safe spaces for queer people. This was, unfortunately, recently the case for a pride parade in Bautzen, a town in Saxony, Germany.
This is Marian and Wiktoria, your podcast hosts for this episode, are currently standing in a shutdown exhibition of the late 1990s. It is about the history of Sachsenhausen Memorial and has a part about people that try to commemorate homosexual victims in the 1980s here.
This opens up a ton of questions. Queer people, people that didn't fit sexual or gender norms, have existed throughout time and space, even if they probably did not identify with our mother term of queer. Looking at pre-existing criminalisation of homosexuality and then Nazi ideology of exclusion, gender and racial ideology highlights how queer people quickly became targets of persecution.
Why, then, was it so difficult for the collective memory of the German society to remember their suffering during the Nazi regime? In this episode of Remembrance Podcast, we want to explore the rocky, difficult way of remembering queer victims of the Nazi regime.
We will take a closer look at one of the homosexual activist groups in the 1980s and their actions to finally fight for a place for homosexual victims in the culture of remembrance at the Sachsenhausen concentration camp memorial. It's May 8, 1945. The Second World War has just come to an end with the capitulation of the Third Reich. Finally free from the regime of the National Socialists, expectations were high for justice and reparations for the victims of the Nazi reign. All concentration camps are dissolved. The people now freed from their shackles start over, adjusting to living in this better, hopeful, post-war reality. But not everyone.
After the war, queer survivors hoped for release of our prisoner, punished and imprisoned under paragraph 175. For discontinuation or suppression of all pending proceedings in this regard, removal and erasure of all photographs from the so-called criminal album, and striking previous convictions relating to paragraph 175 from the criminal record. But that wouldn't happen overnight.
But let's start from the beginning. What is paragraph 175, and why did it make life so hard for queer survivors of the war?
Well, paragraph 175 was a provision in the German Criminal Code, established in 1871, that criminalized homosexual acts between men, with its severity increased significantly during the Nazi era, when thousands of men were prosecuted, imprisoned, and sent to concentration camps due to this law. The paragraph pertained the so-called indecency between men and stated the following.
A man who engages in indecent activities with another man or allows himself to be abused for indecent activities by another man shall be punished with imprisonment.
In 1935, the law undergoes a revision, adding a subparagraph, 175A, which only intensifies the persecution of homosexual men by broadening the scope of criminalized activities and increasing the penalties.
But the law isn't abolished in 1945. In the GDR, the paragraph remains in its form until 1950, when the Supreme Court of the GDR decides to enforce a milder version of it. Let's break it down why the paragraph still being enforced posed such a problem for queer survivors.
Shortly after the end of the war, many persecuted groups are making headway towards rehabilitation and getting compensation for the horrors they endured. For example, through becoming members of the Association of Persecutees of the Nazi Regime, or in German, die Vereinigung der Verfolgten des Naziregimes, for short VVN.
The VVN strictly refuses to accept former Pink Triangle prisoners. Persecution under paragraph 175 is not sufficient for recognition, even if a survivor lived through many years of imprisonment in a concentration camp. For that reason, some try to pass off as politically persecuted. However, even those whose political persecution cannot be doubted are often stripped of their status as a homosexual if a previous conviction under Section 175 becomes known.
Queer survivors were also deemed inappropriate to obtain the status of victim of fascism, created in 1945 in Berlin. This status, associated with numerous material benefits, is only granted to those persecuted politically, or under the Nuremberg race laws. So once again, the queer victims have no way to rehabilitate after the war.
Due to this stigmatization, many people feel shame and guilt, sometimes so intensely they erase the queer element from their own biographies altogether and struggle in silence. That in turn leads to difficulties in establishing gay communities. After all, you need people to create them, but how can you do that when no one's willing to speak up about their experiences?
It all changes when survivors break the silence and have the courage to speak out. The earliest account we know of a homosexual identifying himself as such, publishing his experiences of persecution under the Nazis, was written by Leo Klaasen. He wrote about his experiences in the 1950s in a homophile magazine called Humanitas, which was published in 7 parts under a pseudonym.
We were registered by name and number in a list, and then we were told that, according to an order from the Reichsführung SS, our category had to be isolated in an intensified punishment company, and that the next morning we would be transferred to the large brickworks Klinker. We had only just arrived at the beginning of our martyrdom. The suffering that now began for us was immeasurable and unimaginable.
In a brutal and honest tone, he describes the deadly condition of the punishment unit at the Klinkerwerk in Sachsenhausen for homosexual prisoners. He also refers to conditions for homosexual people in the 1950s. He inspired hope.
We survivors, however, carry the names and scars of our fallen brothers in our hearts, and have not given up the fight against the hydra of hatred, ignorance, and mercilessness of our time, against the brother man, but have taken up the fight as always.
The one book that would become a breakthrough and important source for activist groups in the 1980s, though, was Die Männer mit dem rosa Winkel, The Men with the Pink Triangle. After almost 30 years, Joseph Kohut, more widely known under the pseudonym Heinz Heger, was one of the first ones to write about his experiences in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. It was one of the first public accounts of a homosexual man writing about his time in concentration camps, which after its publication in 1972 gained popularity in the homosexual community.
Born in 1915 in Vienna, Austria, he was arrested after the annexion of Austria by the Gestapo in 1939 and convicted of homosexual activity under Austrian law. First imprisoned for 7 months in an Austrian prison, he was deported to concentration camp Sachsenhausen and then transferred to concentration camp Flossenbürg, where he remained imprisoned until the end of the war. Not only sexual relations with capos and a block elder contributed to his survival, but also an unusual supportive family that sent him money helped him survive throughout his long imprisonment.
Many other men convicted under paragraph 175 were not as lucky. After the war, he returned to Vienna, meeting his partner Wilhelm Krapfel in 1946. Both lived together until his death in 1994. Kohut was one of the very few who tried to obtain compensation from the Republic of Austria and recognition of his imprisonment. These applications remained unsuccessful until shortly before his death, and then also only partly compensated.
His remembrance report came into existence because an old friend of his was interested in documenting his story as a persecuted homosexual and his time at concentration camps. Between 1967 and 68, both sat together during a lunch break for 2 hours, and Kohut began to tell his story.
We newcomers were put into the same work detachments that our entire block was assigned to, the clay pit at the clinker brickworks. This clay pit, which we prisoners called the death pit, was known and feared in all the other concentration camps as the factory for the extermination of human beings and was the Auschwitz for homosexuals until 1942.
Not only was Kohut selected with other persecuted Pink Triangle prisoners and put into the penal unit at the clinker brickwork, where the forced labor was very strenuous and the living conditions deadly, but he was also assigned to the SS shooting range, according to his report, where marked homosexual prisoners were shot down for their cruel amusement.
After just a few days, groups of SS men came to the range to hold their practice shooting sessions. We soon found out that the SS men didn't like shooting at the targets as much as they preferred to use us prisoners as targets and hunt directly for individual wheelbarrow drivers.
As active as he was to break the silence and try to shine a light on victims of the Nazis that were persecuted as homosexual, he never formed or was part of a bigger group advocating for homosexual rights. In the years following the publishing of The Man with the Pink Triangle, though only in Western Germany, the social movement would gain more traction, finally resulting in the formation of many homosexual activist groups throughout both German states in the early 1980s. In this episode, though, we decided to focus on the homosexual movement in the GDR.
Anyone who was homosexual in the GDR in the early 1980s lived under a taboo. Heterosexuality was considered a natural expression of sexuality, and anything that deviated from this was not allowed to exist. The legal situation remained repressive despite the abolition of the so-called gay paragraph 175 in 1968.
So it is not surprising that many homosexual men and women suffered under this sexual morality. The Protestant Church of the GDR offered a way out. The separation of church and state laid down in the constitution made it possible for opposition-minded GDR citizens to raise issues relating to peace, the environment, human rights, equality, and minorities. And so the church became a forum for the Leipzig homosexual work group.
In the fall of 1981, an informal gay group was founded in Leipzig. Here, a few men talk about their homosexuality and the discrimination they experienced, including Edward Stapel, then a theology student at Leipzig University. But it did not stop there. In January 1982, the group attended a conference at the Evangelical Academy, Berlin-Brandenburg, on the topic of homosexuality as a question for theology and the church. This provided the momentum to go public.
Ja, am Ende solcher Gruppe, also nach einem halben Jahr ungefähr, ist ja die Frage, war es das jetzt oder machen wir daraus nun was? Haben wir das nur für uns selber gemacht oder wollen wir es jetzt mal auch für andere machen? Für mich war die Antwort immer schon klar, da muss man was draus machen. Für viele in der Gruppe war das so klar nicht. Und irgendwann tauchte die Idee auf, ich weiß nicht mal von wem. In der Kirche gibt es allerhand Gruppen, also machen wir da auch eine.
In April 1982, the opening event of the working group Homosexuality of the Protestant Student Community Leipzig, or AKHS, took place under the theme Taboo Homosexuality. How do we deal with it?
Inspired by the Leipzig group, homosexual working groups were soon formed in other cities too. Founding member Eduard Stapel later notes that by the end of the GDR, there was a homosexual working group in almost every large city in the GDR: Berlin, Dresden, Magdeburg, Erfurt, Aschersleben, Jena, and Chemnitz. But that's not all. The circles also kept in close contact with each other. From April 1984, representatives of all the circles met regularly to exchange ideas, discuss problems and issues.
It was by far not smooth sailing for homosexual activist groups. The unwillingness to give queer people space in society can be seen in the conflicts of a homosexual group such as AKHS with state institutions such as the state memorials. Inspired by written witness reports of homosexual witness, the efforts of the group to commemorate homosexual victims of the Nazis were often hindered.
A prime example of it is the attempt at a wreath-laying at Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald concentration camp memorials on Christopher Street Day in 1984. The AKHS Leipzig, along with many other activist GDR groups, had been planning to lay a wreath at the memorials. Unfortunately, the groups had been under the surveillance of the GDR state security, the Stasi, for some time. They knew in detail about their plans and which people and groups would take part in. In their files, the Stasi states:
In this context, it can be assessed that some hostile negative persons of these homosexual groups tried to prove that homosexuals in the GDR were persecuted and discriminated against in a similar way as during fascism. These individuals see the planned wreath-laying ceremony on the June 30th, 1984 as a trial of strength with the state.
With this weird argumentation, referring to no further sources why the Stasi believed the groups also wanted to express the repressions of the GDR, they state how they want to prevent public relations activities in cooperation with the state police. It probably tells more about the fear of the state and knowledge of the repression system than anything else.
Ultimately, the wreath-laying could not take place, as the Stasi prevented the groups entering. Only individuals of them could visit. The wreath loops with the writing had to be cut off, and guestbook entries where you could write down possible political messages were forbidden.
A similar situation took place just a year later, when the activist groups of GDR again tried to lay a commemorative wreath in Sachsenhausen. In spite of the Memorial Directorate's approval of the inscription, the name of the wreath donor, the Reunion of Berlin Gay Groups, was missing on the ribbon. The wreath was therefore decorated with a pink ribbon smuggled in. However, the dedication for the prisoners with the pink triangle had to be cut off.
One more example of this unwillingness of the State Memorial Sachsenhausen to recognize queer victims of the Nazi regime was that another Berlin homosexual activist group gave Gehud's book, The Man with the Pink Triangle, a book that couldn't be published in the GDR, to the memorial in June 1985. Archival documentation proves that this book was only formally recognized in January 1991, only after the GDR did not exist anymore. It shows once more how the state used different repressive methods to silence and ignore the fates of queer victims.
With the collapse of the GDR, the shelter of the Protestant Church for homosexual people became superfluous. At the beginning of the 2000s, the AKHS finally disbanded. Today, hardly anyone knows that it was the nucleus of the homosexual movement in the GDR and how lesbians and gays stood up for their rights in that state. The public and historiography have also forgotten this. A major monograph on the commitment of homosexual people in the GDR is still missing today. This is bitter for many contemporary witnesses and those involved. Eduard Stapel will also not live to see the homosexual movement receive the full attention it deserves. He died of cancer in 2017.
Sitting here today on 29 September 2024, we can look back at the remembrance efforts taken. It is an incredible story about strength, resilience, and how you have to be, and here I quote, annoying without end when it comes to rights and concerns of marginalized groups.
In the GDR, a social climate change was not heralded until Section 175 was relaxed in 1968, and then in the Federal Republic of Germany in 1969. In the 1980s, the so-called forgotten victim groups slowly came to the attention of a wider public, and new compensation options were created. A year later, the Federal Republic created the hardship funds, in which homosexuals were now explicitly included, but still with a big asterisk. They were included only in a case of having served a concentration camp sentence. Homosexuals with a prison or penitentiary sentence weren't taken into consideration.
Finally, in 1994, Section 175 was completely abolished. Since then, there has been no special criminal law for homosexuals in Germany. On July 23 in 2002, the German Bundestag repealed the sentences passed under Section 175 during the Nazi era. In May 2008, a memorial erected by the Federal Republic of Germany to the homosexuals persecuted under National Socialism was unveiled in Berlin.
The stories of queer victims of the Nazi regime, once marginalized, are now being brought into the light as a part of a broader movement to recognize and honor their resilience and suffering. Queer activist groups, historians, researchers, friends and family of the queer victims of fascism make efforts to preserve their memory and ensure their stories are not forgotten. Those include the creation of educational programs, digital archives dedicated to queer victims of the Holocaust, or memorials like the ones here in Sachsenhausen concentration camp memorial.
Still, at the end of this episode, I do want to highlight once more. The stories we have encountered and told show gradual progress in making queer history visible. But this hard-won progress can be quickly turned around much faster than one may think. The rise of far-right movements and parties all around Europe fills us with concern. State institutions were rarely the drive behind making society more equal. It mostly comes from the civilian population. It is up to us to be vigilant and not take a status quo for granted.
Thank you for listening. We hope you learned something new today, and we encourage you to look into this topic and visit the memorial sites yourselves, so that you can experience history firsthand.
This podcast episode was recorded as part of the summer school Remembrance Podcasts, Persecution of Queer People under National Socialism, organized by Deutsche Gesellschaft e.V. and GFPS-Polska. The project is funded by the EVZ Foundation and the Federal Foreign Office as part of the program Young People Remember.